What is an object? Is a tree an object? What about a table? An apple? A person? An idea? Or a planet? In simplest terms, we can say that an object is a thing that can be observed and which exists independently of our observation. Or, in the words of American thinker Charles Sanders Peirce, anything that we can think or talk about. So, what is a subject then? Is a tree a subject? Can ideas or celestial bodies be subjects? A common definition goes something like this. A subject is a being with a unique consciousness and unique personal experiences. Or we could say, a subject is an entity with relationships with other entities that exist outside itself. To summarize, we can say that a subject is an observer, and an object is something being observed. The study of what is being as such is called ontology, and it's a part of a larger field of study in philosophy known as metaphysics. This will be a very broad surface level overview, and there are many oversimplifications ahead. Let's go back to our objects. Now that we at least have a reasonable understanding of what an object is, we can ask ourselves a couple of questions about the nature of these objects. Like, are there any non-objects? In what ways can objects be different from each other? Is there some other category that we may contrast with objects in a meaningful way? The way different thinkers have contrasted objects from these presumed non-objects have been varied since different metaphysicians have had different starting points and different perspectives. The ways in which they distinguish between objects and this something else may not always fit precisely into this object-non-object dichotomy. So, one thing we may consider are properties. Does an object have properties? Or should we see the object as a product of its properties? Let's say we have a thing, a tree for instance. Now, say it's a very tall tree. Is that the same object as before? Or is it a tall tree object? Or is it the same object but with a different property? Or have we just manipulated its height property? The way we see this distinction may of course affect if we see the world as containing objects and tons of potential properties, or if there are an insane amount of objects all with their properties baked in. This in turn will affect how we perceive change. Does objects acquire new properties but stay the same in their objectness? Or are objects morphing into different objects? Discretely being born again? Or are they continuously transforming? We will discuss the problem of change when we talk about substance. This apple is red. But was it always red? Will it always be red? If red is a property of the apple, does the property change or does the object change? Other apples may have the exact same red hue. They may exist in different times and at different locations, but they share the same timeless property. A succinct way of saying this is that properties are nowhere in space and time, whereas objects are somewhere. Here's another object. Wait, it's a subject. Oh, well, it's both, depending on our perspective. Since anything we can think about is an object, he can be an object of our thoughts. At the same time, he clearly is a being with a unique consciousness and unique personal experiences. Think of it this way. Anything you would acknowledge as having an experience of the world is a subject. That which does not is an object. In analytic philosophy, the issue of subjecthood, point of view, or subjectivity is seen as a major intractable problem in what is called philosophy of mind. In his 1974 essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, Nagel argued that explaining the subjective experience of what it is like to be something is beyond the reach of scientific inquiry, since scientific understanding requires an objective perspective by definition. Influenced by Marxism and psychoanalysis, many thinkers in the continental tradition have, since the early 20th century, spent a lot of time grappling with the idea of the subject and the self, in relation to other subjects, to society, to hierarchies of power, etc. From Lacan's split subject and Heidegger's Dasein to the social constructions of Althusser and Foucault. We talked a bit about the ways objects might change over time. Is it really that the object itself changes, or does it just acquire new properties? Or is it something else? Since way back, philosophers have been discussing the substance of objects. Theories of substance can be straightforward and confusing at the same time. Philosophers have had one view or the other throughout time, and these views can be quite different but also somewhat overlapping. In ancient Greece, before the time of Socrates, Thales claimed that everything was made up of water, while Anaximenes believed everything to be composed of air. Anaximander held a slightly more original view, that everything was made up of some indeterminate substance, which in turn could transmute into other elements such as earth, water, fire, and air. Pythagoras believed that all was numbers, that harmonious mathematics in its purest form was the substance of the universe. Other pre-socratic philosophers such as Empedocles and Democritus had the, to our ears, pretty modern view that everything was made up of atoms, differing in shape and size and weight, that could combine into different materials. Beginning with Parmenides, things began to change. Theories of what the world was made up of got more elaborate and based on more structured philosophical arguments. Parmenides was also a monist, that is, he also believed that there was basically just one substance, the substance that made up the world he called the One. The One is assumed to be eternal and unchanging, which leads to the following. What has become cannot have become, since there is nothing outside of reality that could have been its source. Thus, our perceived reality is an illusion. The real world doesn't permit change, so the change we perceive must be illusory. Hence, there is another world that is more real than ours. Which leads us to Plato. Plato held the same belief, but in a more pronounced and structured way. He saw our world as a pale reflection, a shadow of the world of forms. The forms are the ideal versions of what we find around us. A cat gets its catness from the cat form. It's not as perfect, but still, we recognize it as a cat. It gets its white color from the whiteness form. If you draw a circle, it will never be a perfect circle. If you zoom in close enough, you will discover irregularities. Not so with the circle form. All things have forms. Courage, numbers, animals, chairs, clouds, beauty, dodecahedrons, and so on. Plato's student Aristotle saw it differently. We live in the real world, but still, objects must be made up of specific substances that make them what they are. Aristotle allowed for the cat to be made up of catness. This is its primary substance. Secondary substances can be things like white, or black, or blue, tailless, fat, and so on. Aristotle argued that Plato's theory of forms was unnecessary. If Plato saw the instantiation of forms as a top-down phenomenon, Aristotle saw it as bottom-up. Cats aren't imitating some cat form, they're simply made up of catness. If there weren't any cats, no more catness. For Plato, there would still be a cat form, but without beings participating in the form. Substance theory was pretty much taken for granted until the 18th century. Hume criticized the theory of substance and claimed that since substance cannot be perceived, it should not be assumed to exist. According to Hume, an object consists of its properties and nothing more. This is called bundle theory. So, this apple isn't made up of some appley appleness. It's just an object that happens to be hard, sweet, red, juicy, waxy, and round. Habit makes me understand this as an apple. Apple is just a loose nickname I happen to use to represent a bunch of qualities. This is roughly how empiricists see it. Later philosophers from all sorts of schools and traditions such as Nietzsche, Heidegger, Whitehead and Deleuze have also criticized substance theory as either meaningless, faulty, or already settled. Today there are still disagreements in some parts of philosophy about detail, but between camps there can be radically different views.